right now we're seeing a rise in religious violence in North Africa and also in the Middle East and in South Asia. But we have to look at the conditions for the violence that's happening. It's not as simple as saying Islam is violent, and so we're seeing a rise in Islamic militants. We're also seeing a rise in Christian militants. We're seeing armies that are calling themselves, in Nigeria, for example, the Lord's Army, and actually quoting from Christian scriptures. There's a massive shift of the balance of power happening in the Middle East right now and in North Africa. And so what's happening is, after the end of the Arab Spring, the Arab uprising, we saw a lot of these governments begin to fail. A lot of the central governments leaders were deposed. And so what's going to fill the vacuum? Exactly the same very predictable thing. Mafias, self-made militias, self-made security. If your state's not providing security for you, you got to provide it for yourself. And so there's a vacuum, and these groups are stepping into the vacuum. So that's one common denominator, which has nothing to do with religion. The second is economic devastation. There's a massive competition for scarce resources. And where there's a competition for scarce resources, people begin to bifurcate along identity lines. Whatever that identity is, whether it's tribal, whether it's ethnic, but in this case we're seeing a lot of the polarization of identity happen along religious lines. And so what we're seeing in ISIS is a proxy war. ISIS is not just a crazy group of militants, but they're being funded and supported from somewhere, who knows where. But so there's a need for safety. And so who's the most vulnerable in that context? In the context where ISIS is controlling parts of Syria and Iraq, are the minorities, the religious minorities, the Zoroastrians, the Yazidis, the Christians. There's been a massive Christian diaspora. There used to be an estimated 1.4 million Christians in Iraq, and now there are an estimated 400,000. So Christians have become a very persecuted community in this context. But also anyone that's outside of the up until now Shia-controlled government, the Shia majority government, which has not done a good enough job of incorporating minority voices, Sunni minority voices, into the government. There's a new movement that's happening in the diplomatic community, among governments, among countries, and also among religious leaders. What's happening is countries are realizing, the diplomatic community is realizing, in a massive way, that they can't conquer this problem of Islamic extremism or of Christian militias, whatever the militia is. They can't conquer this problem of religious violence. Governments are realizing if we're going to tackle this problem, a military intervention is absolutely necessary, but just a small piece of the overall puzzle of peacemaking. And so we need to involve religious leaders, the right religious leaders, in those contexts to help with larger programs of prevention of violence, but also reconciliation after a ceasefire is negotiated. Governments are realizing that religions have provided the inspirational resource for every positive movement for social change in our recent history. And I'm thinking about, in our own context, the movement to abolish slavery was a religious movement. The movement for India to gain independence was a religious movement that contributed enormous positive good in that region. The movement after the end of apartheid in South Africa to reconcile was a religious movement. It could only have been done by the religious community, by the churches. This movement, too, will have a religious component that will provide the inspirational resource and the human resource. I mean, with that resource, it will succeed. It will be much more powerful.